But then you have the other side, which is the materialist mindset, which is dealing with the child as if they're only a body. So if they're being rude and selfish, you're like, oh my gosh, they need a nap, right? They might need a nap, but they may also need some other interventions that we don't talk about on the show. So
welcome to Scholé Sisters, the podcast for the classical homeschooling mama who seeks to learn and grow while she's helping her children learn and grow. Scholé Sisters is a casual conversation about topics that matter to those of us in the trenches of classical homeschooling who yearn for something more than just checking boxes and getting it all done. I'm your host, Brandy Wenzel. You can come study Charlotte Mason with me over in the Charlotte Mason Think Tank. Go to afterthoughtsblog.net/think tank to learn more. My co-hosts today are Misty Winkler and Abby Wall. Misty is a homeschooling mom of 5, including 1 graduate. She writes and podcasts at simplyconvivial.com and is the author of The Convivial Homeschool, now available on Amazon. Abby is basically the queen of the Scholé sistership. Abby is a country-living farmer rancher, a loving wife, and mom of 5 who homeschools and reads whenever she can. Are you as excited about this year's local online retreats as we are? The physical delivered in your mail hostess kits have sold out just like I predicted, but this doesn't mean we aren't accepting more hostesses. If you want to host, just grab our digital hostess kit and start planning your own local retreat. It's the perfect thing for the homeschool mom group, even if not all your members are classical or Charlotte Mason. This year, we'll be talking all things habits and habit training. To register to be a hostess or just to attend, head over to scholesisters.com/habit and sign up. Today's episode is the first in a 3-part series designed to get you started on forming an educational philosophy. Whether you've been studying philosophy for years or you are brand new to classical homeschooling, you are going to love today's discussion, which centers on the nature of man. And so, without further ado, let's get to it. Let's jump into our Scholé Everyday. Who would like to go first?
I would. This is Abby. My summer goal this summer was to read a new natural philosophy. The subtitle is Recovering a Natural Science and Christian Pedagogy by our friend, Ravi Jain, and then 2 other authors, Robbie Andreessen and Chris Hall. And I know Chris Hall wrote a book on the common arts as well, which I have not purchased yet, but maybe by the end of this episode I will. But it is so delightful to read. It's very in-depth. I really needed to kind of get some inspiration for science and, more of that for our homeschool. And we live in a world that, science is kind of the be all end all to everything. And how he explains this more classical approach and how it is connected to creation, to the created order, to the cosmos is just kind of the step back and removing my modern lenses approach to these ideas. So also, it's talking more from like a classical Christian school perspective, but I think there is a ton of applications for homeschoolers as well. But it's always grounded in God and Christian piety, which makes sense because, the liberal arts tradition just talks so much about that, and nurturing loves. So I really appreciate his or their perspectives and things like that. And I did have a couple things. Thinkers today frequently confuse the terms nature, science, and technology. So let us disentangle them. The term art comes from the Latin ars, meaning skill, and the Greek word is techne. The traditional understanding of an art or techne was a practice that was honed to perfection over time by both imitation and reason. Any art or skill was considered consistent in union of reason and practice. Science, on the other hand, simply meant knowledge, since scientia is the Latin word for knowledge. Arts, or techne, produce things using reason or science, but science itself was merely the possession of knowledge, whether it was used to produce anything or not. Natural philosophy went one step beyond natural science in its pursuit of wisdom within the knowledge. And he just talks about the different philosophers, like how Bacon talks about, knowledge is power. And in our modern eyes, science or knowledge is power and power is technology. Thus, science is equal to technology. He goes on to say, in ancient and medieval conceptions, nature was God's handiwork, and its structures and patterns always exceeded man's capacity to understand.
Love.
And he goes on to go into depth of like why we can't have this equal footing with God. And he just illuminates how science and technology and natural philosophy and just these differences. And so it's a great read. It's very encouraging, inspiring, and lots of practical ways to bring that into the classroom or your homeschool. So I've been really enjoying it.
Cool. Next.
I'll go next.
All right.
This is Misty, and I have something a little bit different for me anyway. I am reading A Gentleman in Moscow. Well, I'm listening to it.
I'm sorry, I had to laugh because isn't it Moscow? Like,
yes, it's Moscow.
Yes. Like, you live in Moscow, but I'm pretty sure this dude's not in Idaho.
Yeah, it was funny. I didn't know anything about this book. I've heard the title for several years in various places, and it had come up a few times earlier in the year. And so I came across it at some point when I had an Audible credit. So I used an Audible credit, or it might have even been included in Audible. Maybe that's why I have it.
Oh, nice.
It's Towels, right? TOW.
Yeah. So the author is Amor Towles. I didn't realize before I began that it's set in Russia, but it's not actually a Russian novel. The author is American. And it's super recent. It was written in 2016. So I didn't realize that going into it, but I got about, 6 hours into the 14-hour novel. And then I was like, I'm enjoying it and I like it, but it really doesn't seem like a Russian novel. And I was trying to think of why that was.
Not depressing enough.
It really isn't depressing enough.
I could probably read it and be okay.
Like bad things are happening to him, but the guy is he stays upbeat. I mean, he goes through, he is going to try to commit suicide for a little bit, but he's still, even though he has this whole plan to commit suicide, he's still helping people and like interested in other people. And also, usually only one name is used for all of the characters. So I'm like, it just doesn't have that confusing Russian vibe to it.
You didn't have to draw like a character chart in order to understand the book.
Exactly. So it's really interesting because it's set when the Bolsheviks took over, and it kind of skips several years. So this guy's under house arrest, basically, in a hotel in Moscow under the Bolsheviks, and is shielded a little bit from what's really happening in Russia. He loves Russia, and he just catches glimpses of what's going on in the ups and the downs from different people who come and go from the motel or hotel. One thing that tipped me off to the fact that this is a modern book for sure, that it is written recently, is it's like the author is trying to say that even someone who is alone and independent and unconnected can still have a kind of family. And that you don't, it's like an unconventional family that's told in such a way that it's completely sufficient and just as good as.
Right.
So he's not married, but there's still a woman. and his connections are a friend. And then the other people in the hotel, like the employees of the hotel, are kind of like brothers. And in the end, he kind of takes responsibility for a child and raises a child. But he never really, the way that he develops those family replacements is given as if it's completely adequate, which was really interesting. So it's definitely a modern novel and non-Christian, but really well told and still very interesting and fascinating.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, I've heard people, they enjoyed it. Like it was well written and yeah, like you said, interesting. So, and probably going to stick around for a while.
Well, my turn.
Your turn.
All right. I am so excited about this book. And what's really funny about it is it's probably not even that great of a book. But when I was in the 5th grade, I checked a book out of the school library and just loved it. And I think it was because it was my first contact with dystopian fiction, which obviously I have an affection for. So I have spent the last 34 years trying to remember the title of the book. And by now, like all I can remember are my impressions of finding the book so interesting and fascinating. But I couldn't find it because I couldn't remember anything specific. Like I couldn't remember the author name. I couldn't remember the title. And I mean, like I've looked at lists of dystopian fiction that was popular in the 1980s and this never came up. And I'm randomly listening to a very old episode of Stories Are Soul Food. And it's from like the beginning of COVID, during the beginning of the shutdown. And they have on actually it's 2 guests. They have on 2 guests. And at some point, one of the hosts asks the female, there was a female guest and a male guest, the female guest, like, if you what book would you recommend for kids right now? And she says, The Girl Who Owned a City by O.T. Nelson. And she starts to describe it. And I'm like, this is the book. This is the book I've been looking for 34 years. Amazing. So I bought it and it showed up at our house like 2 days ago. And I started reading it aloud to my kids today, which means I'm not very far in. But I really couldn't remember. Like I remembered that it was a very Lord of the Flies kind of thing where all the kids are alone. There's no adults. But I couldn't remember how it happened. But in the Stories Are Soul Food interview, she was explaining that it was a plague. The plague had wiped out everybody that had hit puberty. So it was like only 12 and under survived.
Wow.
So I was just like, oh my goodness, this is so perfect. So I was just going to read one little thing though, because I remembered that I loved this book, but I don't even know why I loved it because it's been so long. I mean, already in the beginning, it's dealing with, I would say it's written probably for kids, but it's written respectfully in the sense that it's not avoiding any of the big ideas. So for example, in order to survive, the main character is basically looting. Like it starts out with her breaking into a house, trying to find food and other supplies for them. And she's like dealing with the conscience issue, but then telling herself, someone else is going to come take it. But also the owners of the house are dead. Every adult is dead. She's in this house and she starts looking around and she finds a letter that the owner of the house had written to his son who was away at military school somewhere. And he's giving advice to the son because the son is on the cusp age where he thinks that possibly he could survive if he goes and gets some vaccine somewhere that someone had done, seemed to be working with people who were over 12, but under 18, basically. Anyway, the thing about the letter that I found so interesting is that when he ends the letter, it is so different from the darn customer service emails that I get all the time, even now, that are all stay safe. If I get one more email signed, stay safe, I swear I'm going to have to write some sort of reply that explains to them that safety is not even in my top 5 of most important things.
Safety is not a virtue.
It's not a virtue. And I'm like, I don't even, I'm like, I think I've even changed it with my kids where I don't even, like, even when I think they're going to be dangerous, I don't say stay safe. I say, don't be stupid. Right.
Yes, we always tell our kids make good choices.
It works. Yeah.
But maybe we need to make you a shirt that says safety last.
Yeah, really. Seriously.
I love it.
Seriously. After all the other priorities, then you can also be safe. If it's still an option in light of all the other considerations. So the dad ends the letter, "We love you, son. Be brave."
Mm.
And I was like, that is what a good parent says to their child in a hard time. And I think actually that's why I loved the book, because I was thinking about this. I was the exact same age as the main character of the book. It talks about how just a week ago, she was sitting in her 5th grade social studies class with not a care in the world. And now here she is trying to scavenge food for herself and her brother. Anyway, as a 5th grader myself, I identified, with the main character and with her becoming like this responsible, brave person with ingenuity and creativity in tough times. So I'm very excited to read it. I wouldn't say it's the best written book in the whole world. I mean, it's probably better than a lot of modern books now, but I mean, I found a couple errors in terms of the timeline kind of already. It's the kind of book that probably needed to be edited one more time in the sense of for all the little tiny details that conflict because there's so much going on. But super fun to read with my kids because not only am I sharing this book that I loved forever, but we happen to have just been through a fake plague. So, I mean, just totally. I probably should explain what I mean by fake plague. It doesn't mean like I actually had COVID. I just mean like fake in the sense of all of the precautions. In this story, people really did drop dead everywhere. Right. So that's a real plague. This is an overblown bad flu. So anyway. Now we're going to get edited on iTunes or whatever. But anyway.
Hi, Abby here to tell you about the sistership. Do you ever feel frustrated with social media? Scroll looking for good ideas, like beautiful pictures, and follow accounts that portray an ideal? But when you walk away, you feel distracted, dissatisfied, and disappointed with the time that you've wasted? Because what you're really looking for is connection and having real conversations about what matters most to homeschooling moms, about educational philosophy and principles, not just superficial and shallow tips and tricks. Well, the sistership is a place for moms to dig deep into principles and practices, not to waste time. We want to help you connect and find community, not just online, but in real life. The sistership is private, ad-free, drama-free, and free to join. Find your like-minded sisters today. Go to scolesisters.com/sistership.
This episode is the first in a series of 3 that we're going to be doing that are a follow-up actually to episode 106 from last season. That one was called Stop Looking for Hacks, You Need a Philosophy. And that was just Misty and I by ourselves. In that episode, we started asking some basic questions that people could use to start building this rudimentary starter philosophy. And so we said the 3 main questions that you have to answer in order to have a philosophy are: what is a human? What is education? And what does a fully educated person look like? So that is what we're going to be doing this season. We're going to go through all 3 of those questions. And so today is the first question, which is, what is a human? We talked before about how it could take a lifetime to answer these questions, which means we are not fully answering the questions today, just to manage expectations.
Yeah. Which Brandy had to clarify for me as well, because I was very nervous when she brought this up.
Abby was coming down the mountain with her 10 commandments and feeling like they weren't enough. Hold on.
I was overthinking it.
So because it takes a lifetime to answer questions like this,
yes.
Right? Like you can always add something to your understanding of human nature or of education or what an educated person really looks like. Those are the kinds of questions that just continue to grow as you read and think and grow yourself. The way we're going to be doing these episodes, all 3 of us were each coming with 2 answers to the question. So this isn't comprehensive. They might not even be the best answers to the question. But they're the two that we thought of. And I think these are pretty good, actually, looking through our notes. I had everybody type in 2 answers that they found in their reading. So we kind of said, Abby's going to look in Proverbs. I'm going to look in Charlotte Mason. Misty's going to be eclectic because that's what Misty does. And she's happiest when you don't tell her what book she has to read and not read. And then from there, we were each bringing 2 things to the table. And then I actually went through and put them in what I thought was actually a very interesting. It was interesting to me how this became a very logical order.
It looks great.
So it almost looks like we did this on purpose instead of an hour before the show. I was like, oh, this could be put in an orderly fashion. So, but our point is that if you're reading something and you want to build a philosophy, you really could keep a 3-column chart next to you and just start adding bullet points of, well, this is what this person says about being human. This is what they say about education. This is what they say an educated person looks like. You really could just start from any book you're reading, start doing that and keep compiling. And then you got to decide, what does scripture say? And are they actually right?
Mm-hmm.
But over time, that's how you build a philosophy. There's no shame in having a very simple philosophy. That's how we all start. And then philosophy naturally grows. And today is just an example of us doing that a little bit. With that said, Misty is going to start us off with her first observation on what a human is.
Well, I thought the obvious place to start with what a human is by going to the very beginning of humanity and what we are told about humans in Genesis. God created them male and female in the image of God. I mean, I suppose I could fit my rant in here about why the male pronoun is neutral and includes women.
Rant away. I already called it a fake plague. Like, we might as well keep going.
Send all your hate mail to Brandy and Misty.
Actually, don't we give out Haley's address now? We're like, Haley at schoolasisters.com.
So when we talk about what is a human, we can say what is a man, and that includes men and women, because God created man, male, and female in his image. One of the things that I loved from Augustine's On Christian Doctrine or On Teaching, different translations translate the title differently, but On Christian Doctrine, he talks about people being worth something valuable. He talked about our responsibility to love people, including our enemies, not because of the people themselves or anything that's in their individuality, but because God's image is in all people. So when we are talking about loving all people, what we're really loving is God. We can love God by loving people because God's image is in all people. And we'll get to the second part of that later. We aren't perfect anymore, but we were created perfect, and we were created in the image of God. And so our value doesn't come from what we do or any kind of talent, our good looks, our good works, our good anything. It's because of the worth that God put there when he made us in his image.
I love that. That actually reminds me of Charlotte Mason's concept of personhood a little bit, because her first principle, she talks about all, children are born persons. That's like her principle number 1 of education. So the question, of course, is like, well, what is a person? And it's true. She does not get deeply into the image of God. But one of the things that becomes very evident when you start reading through what she's talking about with the person is she is not talking about you're this individual, unique, special snowflake. She's talking about the things that are common to all men. There's a shared humanity. And that's what we're getting at with this question, right? It's so the image of God ultimately is what we all share. So when we say, well, this thing over here, we all share that, no matter what country we were born in, what language we speak, we all share this thing. We're actually, I think, touching on just an aspect of the image of God. So we might have pinpointed something very particular, like children are born curious and learning, and that's part of their personhood. All children are like that. Okay. Well, that's part of what it means to be made in the image of God.
Yes. I too, are we moving?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yep.
Yours rolls right in.
Yes, mine is just kind of piggybacks off of that, because that is so foundational. And if we don't have that concept, then it really does mess up everything else. So because we are created, and, in Genesis 1:31, right after it says he created them male and female, right? It says, and God saw everything he made, and behold, it was very good. When I was thinking about created, it means that it was not an accident.
Ooh.
Creation was from God, is perfectly planned and executed. It's not just a Jackson Pollock where there's paint being thrown on a canvas, right? It is designed, and David talks about it in the Psalms. You knit me together in my mother's womb, right? I am fearfully and wonderfully made, right? Because God's creation is very good. And not only did that creation, not only was it perfectly executed, perfectly created with so many different variations and things like that, right? I just think of, God marching all of the animals out, and Adam naming them, and all of these different things. And a lot of times, so much of our books just talk about how we're all just we're just more highly evolved animals. And there's definite flaws with that, because when we're so different from animals too. Yes, there are certain similarities, right? Like there's DNA and there's different things, but we are so different in some very important ways, like our own creativity. And I think that is because we are his image bearers, right? As Missy was saying, is we are also creative. We also work, and we were given work before the fall, right? Oftentimes we always start with, work and hard work and toil and labor and all those things was after the fall, but that's not how it was, right? We were given to have dominion and working and things like that. And since God worked, right, he rested, he created and then rested and called his work good. And then on, the Sabbath, he rested and called us to rest, right? He's that model for work and human work, right? His was unique, right? Out of nothing, he created everything that is and will be. The Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it, right? To do these things. And so that is something that is unique to us. And that's not something that animals do either, right? We have this creative power. Like I really do believe that everyone, every human being has, creativity in them, because it is how God made us. And I also think that, man is man and woman is made to work. And I think that uniquely human is also that we are made to worship, right? We will worship something. And that is why I think God, commands us to worship him alone, and he is first, right? And so those are the things that as humans, separate us. We were created for a purpose, and we were made to do these things. So
I think it's so important to remember this point. And I think it's something that as Christians, we might take for granted that we're created. But I think that so much of the modern social problems or the modern assumptions actually are an outworking of their Darwinism.
Yes.
And the idea that everything is chance and evolution. And some of the crazy stuff going on is springing from the desire to control evolution and the belief that we can become something that we aren't.
Right.
And that This was my other point that I now remember. And that we're not self-created.
Yes.
Right.
And that is something that is so, I mean, it's so prevalent in our society right now, right? Because we don't acknowledge a creator, we get to decide who we are and what we want to be and all of these things. And it's not about glorifying God and enjoying him forever. It's what's going to glorify me, myself, and I, and whatever makes me happy.
Yeah.
Right. Whatever fulfills me, whatever gives me meaning. I think that's the difference, right? God has made us with a purpose, but the evolutionary telos is that I get to create my own meaning.
Right.
And it's such disordered thinking.
I want to go back to something Misty said, because Misty, you said, as Christians, we tend to take it for granted that we are created. But I was thinking about this, that I think those of us that went to public school, we take for granted that we think that we're created when maybe we don't actually. What I mean by that is we were programmed to think in evolutionary terms. Like that's how we were taught. We were discipled into that mindset. And it's interesting to me how many of us technically believe in creation, want to, but we're given these habits of thought of young children as if we are accidents, as if we don't belong. We're some sort of plague upon the earth, that we're intrinsically evil in the sense that we are strangers here. We're not supposed to be here. We're some sort of sin against nature. Our existence is just purely destructive. I'm even thinking like within the environmental movement, this elevation of wildness over order and how we do not have the right to dictate to creation what it ought to be. All of those things are things that Christians accidentally swallow because of how the public school discipled them into the modernist environmentalist mindset. So technically, we believe in creation, but I think it's super helpful to try to root those things out in ourselves and make sure that we're fully embracing the kinds of things that Abby just said.
Yeah. That those aren't just affirmations that we know and repeat, but they are beliefs that work themselves out throughout everything we think and do.
Absolutely. Number 3?
Yes.
All right. So mine, I took from Charlotte Mason's School Education, Chapter 7. It's the very first sentence. She says, a human being. That's like her little subsection title. And then she says, I have laid before the reader as a working hypothesis that man is homogeneous, a spiritual being invested with a body. I just think it is so important for us to remember this because I think we have these competing tensions within the modern church. And I really kind of think it doesn't matter what branch of Christianity you belong to, because I feel like I've seen people falling off of one side of the horse or the other out of all the different traditions. The first side is the Gnostic side, where the body becomes diminished in importance. Everything is just spiritual, or everything is just unaffected by the body. The child has a sin problem. Everything's a sin problem. It couldn't possibly be that they didn't get enough sleep and need a snack, right? Or at least that couldn't even be a contributing factor, right? Not to excuse sin when we don't feel good, but anyway, but like dealing with children as if they are only souls. But then you have the other side, which is the materialist mindset, which is dealing with the child as if they're only a body. So if they're being rude and selfish, you're like, oh my gosh, they need a nap, right? They might need a nap, but they may also need some other interventions that we don't talk about on the show. So, oh, the knowing laughs. Okay. So anyway, so I just keep thinking about how it's so helpful to keep trying to put the broken pieces back together, because the other thing modernism does is it's just highly analytical. So it's always tearing things apart and never really putting them back together. Because we also can kind of pick our favorite part of the child game, right? Where we're like, well, I'm really comfortable with emotions, so I'm just going to parent my children in terms of their emotional well-being. Or I'm really comfortable with intellects, so I'm going to deny their emotions and only deal with their intellectual growth or whatever, right? Like we just choose the places where we are most comfy, trying to bring it all back together and think about how God created them body and soul together. They're not just a brain. They're not just a spirit. They're not just, their physical, neurological components. And thinking about how if they are a whole, then all those things work together. And to approach them in wisdom means looking for the points maybe of interaction, even in those things where the child needs to be taught not to give into temptation when they're hungry, but also to eat snack at snack time. Like both of those things might be important. So anyway, homogeneous whole, they are soul invested with a body. It's all one and indivisible would be the first thing on my list. Because you guys took image of God, and I knew you were going to. So
thanks for leaving us the easy one, Brandy.
Yeah. Well, I put mine up first. You guys did not get to the notes section. You told me you wrote the outline. So,
all right, Misty, number 4.
So, of course, the counter part also from the beginning of Genesis that we need to remember when we're talking about what humans are, what man is. Even though we're created perfect and in the image of God, that image of God is broken in us. We are fallen. We are sinful by nature from birth, from conception, Scripture says. It's not that society or our environment is what causes brokenness in the world, which is the assumption of the progressive movement, the modernity, postmodernism, ever since Rousseau.
Right.
yes.
And Rousseau's idea of man is what has shaped education, all of public education and even Christian education sometimes, because like Brandy was saying earlier, it's the air that we breathe around us. And what Rousseau taught is that children are blank slates. And so the closer they are to being undisciplined and wild, he had the idea of the savage beast, or not the savage beast.
Noble savage.
Noble savage.
I think you have the idea of the savage beast.
Right. It's Hobbes. Life is brutish, nasty, and short.
Right, yeah.
So Rousseau thought that civilization, society, social environment is what corrupted people. If society were good, people would be good. And so fixing society is how you fix man. And that is at the heart of the social programs, a lot of the social justice stuff. So much of modernity comes down to that assumption, which is flawed and wrong. And so their hope is in fixing society because they don't recognize that it's man himself individually and corporately that is broken and not ultimately fixable apart from Christ. And even in Christ, the total perfection doesn't come till Jesus comes back. So an important thing to remember as we educate our children and raise our children is to not be surprised when they are selfish and when they lie, all on their own. It just comes out of their very own heart. They don't have to be taught these things. They don't have to be taught to sin. That comes naturally. And when we know that that's a natural tendency in our children and in ourselves, we can become better equipped to handle that and recognize that whatever education we're doing or parenting that we're doing is not going to ultimately fix that. But we have to we're parenting and raising them to put safeguards around that and to shepherd them, because individual people are all broken. I was thinking about this even more recently in reading, some more political kinds of things and reading about Marxism this year. I was reading The Conservative Mind by Russell Kirk. And he calls this out as a difference between the conservative and the liberal.
Interesting.
As key to understanding how they want to govern. So what is the government for? What's the perfect government form going to take? Because the conservative mind, he says, which is a Christian mind. You can read Christianity and Liberalism by Machen, if that sounds offensive. It's short and really good. But anyway, the conservative Christian mind recognizes that men are sinful. And so government has to be put in place to help society run, to protect people from the effects of sin. So the government is never going to be able to fix the sin problem. It's just there to put safety measures in place so that we can function and not be at the mercy of other people's sinfulness. It's set up to punish the evildoer.
Right.
Government's primary job is to punish the evildoer. And the assumption is there always are going to be evildoers. And then the conservative mind also recognizes that corrupt people are always going to be seeking power. And so government has to be set up in such a way to attempt to prevent corruption, or at least to be able to call it out. Or it recognizes that corruption will happen. And the more power is involved, the more corruption is going to be involved. Whereas the progressive mind, the liberal mind, believes that there's something in society. It's that society is the problem. And if we fix society, everyone will have a chance to be good and perfect.
This is why I reject libertarianism also.
Yeah, right.
Even though I have great sympathies for it. Some increasingly so.
Right. Because it's just a different attempt at saying, if society were run the right way,
right,
all people would be good.
Right. This reminds me a little bit of my favorite Federalist paper. And I don't remember the number, but I fell in love with it when I was in high school. The title of it was Men Are Not Angels. And I just found it was so interesting that a founding father, he's making an argument for ratifying the Constitution, but it's like, why would we need this kind of a thing? And his main argument was like, because men are sinners. He says men are not angels, but what he means is they're sinful.
Right.
So we need something. And this is a pretty good thing, which, turns out it was a pretty good thing. Is if we would just use it. But anyway, not the point. The point was, it was very interesting to me to see someone making that kind of an argument for ratifying a governing document for a whole country. Like the whole argument was men are sinful. I think my next one dovetails really nicely with what you just said. And this is kind of funny because it's principle 2 from Charlotte Mason, which says children are not born either good or bad, but with possibilities for good and for evil. And a lot of Christians see this as her rejecting the sin nature. And I see it as exactly the opposite.
Yeah.
Because turns out she said they had possibilities for evil.
Right.
So for me, the thing to take away from this is related to their fallen sinfulness, which is this idea that there are born possibilities. So they are not a foregone conclusion in the sense of the Victorian mindset with some sort of fatalism regarding morality, where, Uncle so-and-so was a liar and they look just like him. So they're probably going to be a liar and end up in jail too, to other types of predeterminism that we have in modern life, where we just can kind of think that, I've seen this in hyper Calvinism, where it's like, I have no power. I'm just waiting for God to miraculously intervene, right? It's like almost like this paralyzing thing for the parents to believe certain doctrines. And I think they're believing them just in a wrong way, personally. But anyway, the point is, I love the way and this is an educational principle for her. So what she's really saying is they're not finished and they have possibilities. And so then therefore, it does matter how we educate them and how we parent them.
Mm-hmm.
If we say they have possibilities for evil, then that means, it matters what kinds of books I choose, especially at tender young ages. And both in the sense of protecting them from temptations that they're not ready for when they're little, but also equipping them to stand up and withstand temptations. Like we can't ignore that they are going to face them someday. So it's like it's both the protection and the preparation, I think, that we need there. Assuming that, it doesn't matter what they're exposed to because they, assuming that those exposures aren't a development of taste and that my dear darling angel couldn't develop a taste for something that's evil.
Right. That they're uncorruptible.
Right.
If I just do it right. Or they're just uncorruptible, period.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So just this idea of like when we're, regarding human nature and an educational philosophy, walking in and saying they're not a foregone conclusion either way. So, developing good habits and properly parenting them as far as externalities, all that matters. But then their internalities, things like their own personal habits and their choices, like all those things matter too. So we are, again, trying to be faithful and then also having an open hand in the sense of realizing that we ultimately are not deterministic either. So the nature of their birth does not determine, neither do we really.
Mm-hmm.
So but it matters. So it matters, but it's not determining. The idea that they're born with possibilities goes really well with this idea of being sinful.
Mm-hmm.
If they had been born before the fall, they would only have possibilities for ever growing good. But now they have possibilities for going the wrong direction as well.
Mm-hmm.
Abby, you want to bring us home with your 6th point? Because it's really good.
Yes. So man is at the same time finite and eternal, right?
Yes.
And as finite beings and eternal beings, we are in need of teaching, right? We talked about we're the homogeneous, right? We are body and souls, and they each required to be fed, to be instructed and disciplined, which is education. Exercised. I know. I just get to throw that in every time.
We know.
And we need rest,
Yeah.
right? I was going through the Psalms and I just remember when my babies were babies, just when you lie down, you will sleep in peace, for you alone, Lord, make us dwell in safety, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, he gives rest to us each day and that we require food and all of these things. And I think going through Proverbs, especially, shows us so much instruction about, the 2 types of people, those possibilities for good and evil, the wise and the foolish.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a comparison and a contrast of those 2 possibilities. I think that remembering that we are finite sinners in need of repentance and a savior is a great beginning to, what is a person?
Yeah.
I like that you brought in that sort of an interesting tension between them being both finite and eternal. There's something that really extends the value that we place on children when we realize, they're going to live forever. There's a glory in that. And can be easy to forget, I think, in the day-to-day of motherhood.
Which is why in Psalms, we are reminded, teach us to number our days aright, that we may gain a heart of wisdom, right? How we spend our days, how we bring up our children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, right? These things, how we view them.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
This, I think, was such a fun conversation, but also a fun exercise in the sense of trying to flesh out some of the rudiments of a basic educational philosophy. And I was thinking about how we could just keep going. We could be like, well, now Proverbs also says this.
Yeah.
And
there's
Augustine also said this.
Yeah,
I mean, it
there's
just goes
so
on and
much
on.
more.
Yeah. But hopefully it gives an example of the kind of thing we were talking about in that previous episode in episode 106.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's going to be a fun season to keep doing these, actually.
And how much is just assumed. And when you actually have to sit down and think about it, what a good exercise it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's good for us too.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, I've answered these questions before, but it's easy to keep moving on and not revisit the basics. But I actually think that usually the basic things are foundational. Those are the most important things. And they're the key to understanding all the things we're adding.
Amen.
So, this idea of revisiting the 101 level, we never really get too old for that. I don't think. If we get untethered from these things, then the things we add could start to be a little bit wonky if we're not careful.
Yeah. Well, that's because of our sin nature. We have a tendency to just pull away from truth, and it's easy to drift. Yeah. Like we're going to drift unless we are intentionally, consciously tethering ourselves again and again to God's word.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So anchoring ourselves in the very basic truths about these things like creation, image of God, simpleness, simple possibilities, need for being taught, like all those kinds of things. They're the anchor that keep us from ending up adrift on bad philosophy, I think.
Yes.
Well, great. Well, I think this is going to be a fun series because we get to keep doing this for 2 more times.
And other people get to join in on the conversation too, because there will be a post inside Sistership for this episode. And together in conversation, we can keep adding the layers and applications and grow our understanding through discussion and asking questions and being forced to think through it by answering questions. And it's just such a valuable process.
Yes, I agree. All right. Well, thank you, ladies, for joining me today.
Thank you, Brandy.
Thanks,
it was great.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the sisterhood of the podcast. Make sure you're following us on your favorite podcast player so you don't miss any of our episodes. All of the books and things we mentioned today are linked in our show notes. Just go to scolesisters.com/SS110 to check it out. Don't forget to register for the annual retreat. It's going to be here before you know it. Just go to scolesisters.com/habit to register. Our next episode is the second installment in this 3-part series on building educational philosophies. Misty, Abby, and I will be discussing the classic question of what is education? It's going to be so much fun. Until then, we want to remind you once again that homeschooling is a marathon you needn't run alone, so open up your eyes and look around you. Find your sisters.
Uh-oh.
It's okay. I just had a minute.
Oh, okay. I thought your microphone cut out again.
No. I just needed a moment.
Oh, no, that's fine.
Sorry.
Sorry. Messed up your train of thought, maybe.
No. It's okay. Sorry. I did lose my place now.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Everyone's used to me pausing.
Abby taught me in our last recording that she knows how to land planes. So...
What? Oh, yes. I was like, no.
Metaphorical planes. Abby knows
metaphorical
how to
planes.
Metaphorical airplanes. Did she have more to say?
No, I think that's it.
Okay.
It was a good ending.